Welcome. I want to start with just reminding you to turn off your phones. I'm Jenny Lawrence, a longtime member and former trustee of the New York Society Library, the city's oldest, founded in 1754 by a group of civic-minded New Yorkers who were persuaded that a public library would be very useful as well as ornamental to this city. In another month, we will celebrate our 270th year. Astonishingly, during all this time, we have closed our doors only 3 times. During the American Revolution, of course, briefly in a yellow fever outbreak in 1803, and during COVID's 3-month lockdown in 2020. Thanks to the extraordinary leadership of Carolyn Waters and her resilient staff, the library continued operations remotely through this pandemic. Drawing on the latest resources and technologies, we can say that our virtual doors are always open. The mission our founders outlined so many years ago is ongoing, an engagement with the city's people and the books they are writing and reading. And speaking of books and people who are writing and reading, no better topic is under consideration tonight than the subject of Maggie Jackson's new book, Uncertain: The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure, an exploration of the surprising benefits of not knowing that has become the frontier in the realm of thinking skills. Scientists calling for a return of curiosity-driven experiment, medical students who are being taught the limits of their knowledge, and a hot topic in business, the power of ambivalence to drive good decision-making. What is more, Maggie meets and even manipulates a robot called the I Don't Know robot, created as part of a growing movement to make AI safe for humanity by instilling robots with a new capacity to be, well, uncertain. Maggie is a graduate of Yale and the London School of Economics. She has written articles for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times. Her essays have been collected in State of the American Mind, and she is the recipient of numerous grants, awards, and fellowships. Her first book, What's Happening to Home, was followed by Distracted, Reclaiming Our Focus in a World of Lost Attention, and now Uncertain, which was just named a must-read new release by the Next Big Idea Club, curated by Malcolm Gladwell and others. Perhaps most significant for this gathering is that Maggie has been a library member for 30 years, and many of her articles and books were written in Stack 12's Green Alcove, one of the most coveted writing spaces at the library. Fellow library member and trustee Gretchen Rubin, author of The Happiness Project and Life in the Five Senses, wrote, "With cutting-edge science and insights, both surprising and practical, Uncertain shows how cultivating an open and unsettled mindset can help spark curiosity, compassion, and creativity." Please welcome Maggie Jackson.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And can everyone hear me in all corners? Great, wonderful. No, a little more? Okay, how's that? Okay. Thank you so much, Jenny, for a lovely introduction and for all that you do for the library, for writers, readers, and everyone here. And I'd like to thank Carolyn Waters, who couldn't be here but is in spirit, for all her leadership, which has made the library just sing in recent years. Like to thank Sarah Ellett Holliday, who pulls so many things together with such grace, and Kirsten Carlson, who has helped me so much with research, and the entire staff. And I'd also just like to thank the library itself for 270 years of spirits and spirit and muses and aura. It's palpable here. So, just to start, I'd like to tell a little story. There was once a woman who was very afraid of birds. In fact, she was so fearful of birds that she was a teacher, and when one flew too close to her classroom window, she actually would run to her car and hide. So she went to one of the world's greatest anxiety specialists, and he did one very simple thing. He gave her a guidebook to birds. And within a few weeks, she actually had adopted a pet bird. Well, one reason I wrote this book, and one question I get asked so often, is how can we contend with uncertainty in this world of flux and volatility and unpredictability? And I think the bird story points the way. Because if we can take a closer look, we can discover that a mindset that we fear and we shun is actually a resource for curiosity, for wonder and delight. Uncertainty is scientifically proven to be closely related to human adaptability. It is the source of our nimbleness. Uncertainty is the portal for how we find the humanity in someone whose politics we loathe. And far from being the royal road to angst, uncertainty is actually, leaning into uncertainty, is now being used as a proven, successful treatment to lower anxiety and worry and depression and bolster resilience. So I'm going to talk about these points a little bit as we go along, but first I'll offer a little definitional groundwork because it's such a big, messy topic. We often talk about the uncertainty. That is a shorthand for the unknown. It's actually tantamount to a kind of a lament in the recent years. It's been, the headlines just sing and rue and complain about uncertainty without actually kind of explaining what it is. And, the unknowns will always be with us. We have developed for hundreds of years mathematical ways to kind of take a foothold in understanding likelihood, probabilistic reasoning, mathematical models. I mean, you don't actually know whether it's going to rain on your daughter's wedding day, despite all the models and the forecasts. We just don't know. But in complement, there is our uncertainty, which is really the subject of my book. The human response to the unknown is our psychological, our inner uncertainty. That is an unsettling feeling we gain when we reach the limits of our knowledge, when we realize we do not know. And so that's where I'll start, with the unsettling nature of uncertainty, the fear factor. So when we do meet the new, the unexpected, the ambiguity, we have a human response, and it's usually dislike. We don't like uncertainty, and that is because humans evolved to need and want answers. So for survival's sake, of course, we don't like to be not knowing. But if we look closer, this response to uncertainty that we gain is a stress response. Hormones and chemicals flood the body and the brain, and it might be your first day on a new job, and your heart might beat, or your palms might sweat. You have a bodily reaction to not knowing. But at the same time, and one subject of scientific attention recently has been neural changes when you don't know. Your focus broadens at that moment. Your working memory is bolstered, and your brain becomes more receptive to new data. So uncertainty is actually now seen as good stress, as a kind of wakefulness. It's how we are in tune with the environment, and it's how the brain signals to itself that the status quo won't do, and you need to update your working knowledge of the world. So as one neuroscientist told me, this is the moment when the brain is telling itself something's to be learned here. So in experimental laboratory settings, many people on average who are better at learning in dynamic environments are those who lean into their uncertainty. They are actually most stressed when the things are most unpredictable. So for instance, one classic study was about spotting snakes behind rocks. So there are patterns of rocks, and people had to spot which rock held a snake, and there was an electric shock involved. But people who, I call it, leaned into their uncertainty were the ones who were most accurate in that game. And this has been proven again and again. And the Guardian newspaper actually covered this issue as why humans are hardwired to hate uncertainty, when actually that was not the lesson of the day. It was the wakefulness that we gain from uncertainty. And a more real-world example comes from a study of CEOs in the late 2000s, when there was a European Union expansion. The market was doubling in number. The Central European nations were joining the market. Everything was in disarray. Business leaders were unsure. And so 2 business school professors went to Germany to study the response of 100 CEOs, before and after kind of project. And they found that a certain robust number of CEOs were quite adamant that this expansion would be great for their company, new markets, new customers, etc. And another group was absolutely sure that this would be terrible for their company. Inflation would occur, whatnot. Well, a year later, when the business school professors returned to study how the CEOs had fared, to their surprise, there was a third group in the mix. I think that's really important. They didn't even expect there to be ambivalent CEOs, but there were. And they found that these were the business leaders who were more resourceful. They actually did inventive things like open new factories. They were the leaders who were more inclusive. They listened to multiple perspectives in order to move forward. Those who were most sure of the way actually tended to do nothing at all. So I think what that shows is the wakefulness, the spur, I call it the gadfly of the mind, the provocative nature of uncertainty. If we retreat from, or we're overly fearful of that moment when the brain is telling itself there's something to be learned here, we squander an opportunity to learn. So is that the end of the story? When I actually was starting to write a different book at the beginning. I was trying to write, after Distracted, I thought, if we have a moment's focus, then what can we do with it? Well, thinking comes to mind. And so I started to write a book about reflection and contemplation and various types of thinking that I felt were besieged in the digital age. But the first chapter was about uncertainty, and the book became that. Not only did I find myself falling into a wonderful, incredible, messy hole of fascinating research, but I also found that just at the point when I was poking my nose into the issue of how uncertainty works and what it is, there was an explosion of research in medicine, in business, in science. We had begun as a culture, or even worldwide, to discover something. And how could that be? Tangentially or parenthetically, it's because we are so outcome-oriented that literally, just by example, neuroscientists would put people in a scanner, give them a task, and then not pay any attention to the between times, when people were told to do nothing before the next task occurred. So this outcome orientation led business, organizational management, people in medicine to ignore what uncertainty is. So that's not the end of the story. So is uncertainty just something to eradicate, something that is waking us up and then we move on from there and get into the meat of good thinking? I also discovered, to my surprise, that uncertainty is an accompaniment. It's a strengthening of our thinking in many, many different realms. So to illustrate, picture me in a Toronto operating room and literally feet from a patient. I was up in Canada to try to understand uncertainty's role in superior performance in high-stakes situations. So what better example than surgery? And luckily they allowed me in with my little tape recorder, and I was guided by an expert in surgical judgment who also was very interested in uncertainty. And we were watching one of Canada's top surgeons take out the cancerous half of the liver of a gentleman in the room. And the surgeon in charge was all, efficiency. He was barking orders. He was constantly telling the junior surgeon to go literally, quote, faster, faster. He was watching the clock. He was hurrying things along, and he was very impressive. He was moving through that 5-hour operation because that's the nature of, the surgical ideal. And until he thought he made a lethal error. He thought he had cut the bile duct, which is something that few, if ever, patients can ever recover from. The room felt silent. There was sweat on his cap. I could hear a phone ringing that went unanswered. And this is our ideal of not only just a surgeon, but the ideal of a business leader, the ideal of a general, the ideal of the thinker, no matter where we go. And it bears asking, are there limits to this, idealization of the quick, sure know-how that we adore? So to understand this, we can step back and think a minute about how people gain expertise. How do we become that fluent, fast, dexterity-driven expert? Well, we accrue through thousands of hours of knowledge and experience heuristic shortcuts in the mind, kind of mental models that are ready solutions for recognizable problems. When the doctor hears chest pains, they think heart attack. 80% of fire chiefs on the scene of a conflagration decide within 2 minutes what to do. And they have to. This is natural. This is an impressive and needed form of expertise, except that this type of expertise begins to fail in unpredictable situations. When the routine expert, the person who rests on their know-how, begins to fail outside the comfort zone of their achievement. So in study after study, it's shown that years of experience are only weakly correlated, or not correlated at all, with skill and accuracy in accounting, in business, in medicine, etc. And we all might know that complacent, seen it all. I mean, I know as a reporter, the person who's just writing the same story again, they're applying, not extending their knowledge. But only very recent research into expertise has kind of uncovered another level of expertise, and that is the adaptive expert. The adaptive expert is, on average, more likely to spend more time diagnosing a new complex problem than even a novice. And the adaptive expert wades into the space of their uncertainty, and they're much more likely to evaluate multiple options and to test and assess each of those options. So they're basically inhabiting the question. They're inhabiting their uncertainty. And that's this distinguishing characteristic between superior judgment in unpredictable situations and mediocrity. So And by the way, the surgeon did not kill the patient. The first talk I gave, I forgot to mention that. But he was a couple millimeters off target in the liver. It's an extremely complex organ, and surgeons get lost all the time in the liver. But the bottom line was that he treated it like it was all routine. And to his credit, and also underscoring how this story can tell us so much about the nature of uncertainty in expertise, he and my guide in the operating room, Carol Ann Moulton, decamped to the lunchroom with me and spent an hour or so going over what had happened. And he defended his speed, doubt-free. He defended the badge of his certainty in a very chilling way, whereas she represented the future, which was, and she actually, as a young surgeon, was asked to do one of the profession's most important keynotes just after finishing her PhD, and she actually called for indecision in surgery, which is an incredibly courageous thing to do. And my agent's assistant actually changed her surgeon after reading the draft chapter of this book. So anyhow, the third aspect of uncertainty that I'd like to emphasize today is the social side of uncertainty, because it's not a solo act. We should be uncertain at certain times. It's never the end goal. I mean, we don't want to dwell in irresolution. But as well, we need to share this liminal state. We need to embrace the gray space, the process, the in-betweenness, the space between question and answer together. And one way we can do this is through cultivating dissent and disagreement, which seems completely counter to everything we want to stand for today. More conflict at work, not less. I mean, that seems crazy. But just briefly, and then I'd like to get into another social side of uncertainty. Just briefly, disagreement at work in groups is actually related to intensified discussions, surfacing of inaccuracies, creativity, everything you would want in group collaboration. And it can be easily assumed that when you disagree respectfully, frequently, mildly, that you are having one side win over the other. That's kind of our ideal of the argument. Or you can assume that in diverse situations, the diverse or the dissenting person rides in, waving the flag of the right answer, and everybody falls into line. And that's really a myth. What occurs in, superior kinds of collaboration is that the group becomes uncertain. And we know this partly because a dissenting opinion or an airing of difference, even that's wrong, is actually, provokes a group to gain these performance benefits that I mentioned. It doesn't have to be the right answer. It needs to only push people off the love seat of accord, as I call it. This is true of, I researched climbing teams on expeditions. The innovative, one of the most innovative teams in space history, the great, diverse, innovative, remote and in-person team that put the rovers on Mars. It's true of juries. It's true of sorority sisters doing problems. It is the uncertainty that actually provokes a group to, and it's true in the Supreme Court as well, to have intensified discussions, to find out what they don't know, to know the limits of where they are, rather than, as is so often the case, sliding complacently toward agreement and partly as a result of largely discussing what everybody already knows. If anybody's been to a meeting, that might ring a bell. So that's just a little snapshot. What I really wanted to talk about was a different kind of social side of uncertainty, and that is related to polarization. Polarization needs no introduction in this country. It's almost normalized, sadly enough. There are international studies that show that polarization levels politically are rising around the world, from New Zealand to India and beyond, but nowhere more so than in the United States. 80% of Democrats and the similar numbers of Republicans now say that the other side has few or no good ideas, and that's just one of a long list of terrible sort of mutual recriminations that we hold against the other side. And of course, by many measures, racial segregation in our schools has reached the levels not seen since the 1970s. So we are divided. And of course, this is an incredibly, I could spend all night and then some trying to look for the roots of this polarization, as entrenched as it is. But one root that merits our attention and that's gaining scientific attention is the human capacity to categorize. This is one of our foremost skill sets. We can take a look at a dish and say tasty or poison. We can take a look at a shadow on the trail and instantly say, is it a snake or a stick? We sail through life categorizing. But there's no more sort of double-edged ability that we have when we do so socially. So just for instance, almost immediately we begin to label someone in-group and out-group, almost instantly within milliseconds. And just to illustrate by way of one example of how we process faces. When you see the face of another, your brain immediately deems them, like you or not. And from there, a cascading number of changes occur that have powerful effects. The fusiform face processing areas in the brain go quiet if your brain has decided that's an out-group member. Why? Because you've labeled that person and you are now basically cognitively disregarding them. They become less an individual, they're less memorable to you, they all look alike. And not only that, not only are you processing them in a superficial way, but you're also something called configural face processing also declines. That is, we process the face of someone who's deemed like us in holistic ways. We look at the gist of their face. We spend more time on their eyes. Whereas an out-group member, we focus on the nose or the chin and do so in piecemeal ways. It's really dramatic, and you can see here the roots of stereotyping, discrimination, dehumanization, etc. So what do we do with this? I've dug us further into the hole because this is so innate, so instant, so unconscious. And yet, I'd like to spotlight one strategy which is also gaining scientific attention and is simple but powerful and is a kind of allowing us to combat these innate capacities to categorize. And that is perspective taking, as psychologists use that's the term psychologists use, but we might think about it as our grandmother's wisdom. Think, walk a mile in their shoes, or rather try to understand what their perspective is like. Now, this is not cognitive empathy. It's not feeling their what it's like for them. It's truly purely trying to inject yourself into their perspective. And the ripple effects are quite fascinating. If you think for a minute or two what it's like to be a refugee, newly arrived in this country, you actually are willing to sit closer to that person. You're willing to see them as someone you can work with, as you're willing also, remarkably, to do more you're willing to write a letter on behalf of supporting policies for refugees of all types. So there's a spillover effect, which is also very remarkable. So there are just these powerful implications, cascading implications from this simple exercise. And what is at the bottom of that? Uncertainty. You don't know their perspective. Even if you love and you're like them, you cannot actually know the truth of another person's perspective. This is merely a leap of imagination. It is what Socrates called a infectious perplexity. You're actually jolting yourself a little bit further removed from your assumptions. You're jiggling or jolting, loosening, or moving outside the walls of your own perspective, you can say. And this has become the foundation of a certain kind of political canvassing called deep canvassing. It was started in LA by a LGBTQ group who spent 7 years developing a kind of a doorstep strategy of conversing with political opponents, that is, people who were extremely against gay rights and transgender rights, etc. I went canvassing in LA as they were moving through an opposition neighborhood and sometimes receiving horrific insults just by knocking on the door. But the foundation of their work is perspective taking. They began to throw away their scripts, throw away the talking points that they would trot out to win over, to defeat the opponent, and they began to listen and offer their story and ask the story of the other opponent and see them as a human. And from there, they began to literally, scientific peer-reviewed studies have shown, they began to lower prejudice. And I think the coda, which is almost or as important, is that later studies showed that, and they lowered prejudice by, in 10 minutes, by as much on a scale as the levels of tolerance rose in the United States in 10 years. So they moved the barometer that much in that little time. At the same time, by similar degrees, they actually lowered their own activist hostility toward the other. So there was a mutual, they created a mutual space for learning where they both could be open to one another. It was really exciting, and it was incredible to see in person. Well, I also had another little field trip in this escapade. I went to Durham, North Carolina, and this person I met truly illustrates as well the art and the courage of perspective taking. I met a civil rights activist who was in her 80s, very frail. In fact, she died a few weeks after I interviewed her. Her name was Ann Atwater in Durham, North Carolina. And I'll just like to tell a little of her story, but also say that this story and this type of uncertainty does not erase or preclude or lower or condone our moral responsibility to fight hate or our right to be angry. This is merely a pathway to seeing potential for change in both of us. So Ann Atwater, in 1973, was a housing activist. It was the year that Durham was under court order to desegregate the schools. And so a few months before, and this was in the last city of the United States that was actually going to desegregate. Tensions were at a peak. It was a really messy time, as you know. That someone in the city decided that there would be a series of 10 days of meetings, 10 consecutive days of meetings to pave the way and hopefully to prevent violence. And Ann Atwater was named as a co-chair of this charrette. And someone in the city government named as her co-chair the head of the local Ku Klux Klan. His name was C.P. Ellis. He was a gas station owner. He was virulent bigot, espoused violence, and they hated each other. They knew one another. She had once drawn a knife on him at a city council meeting. There they were. Well, to make a long story short, he called her and said we should do this. She began to talk to him. The meetings did unfold. They were all held in an elementary school in a largely black neighborhood. Things went well. And the tinderbox for at least that moment was put to rest. On the last day of the meetings, Ann Atwater brought in a gospel choir to celebrate. And for all sorts of complex reasons, C.P. Ellis retreated. He retaliated by putting up an exhibit in the elementary school that evening of KKK paraphernalia. Pictures of burning crosses and the robes, and on that evening, a group of black teenagers was headed to that classroom where he was sitting with his exhibit, and they wanted to tear it down. And this is what Ann Atwater did. Atwater stepped forward and blocked the doorway. "What do you think you're doing? Get away from there. Leave that alone," she shouted. "You need to read this material, not tear it up. If you want to know where a person is coming from, you got to see what makes him think what he thinks." That night, she taught them all the promise of tolerance, the mutual need to keep learning, the glory of restraint. But she did something more. In one instant, she freed Ellis from being forever in the wrong, a wrong that could have been her victory. And she freed herself from being on the other side, from being his enemy. Isn't that, in the end, what happens when we liberate one another from the prisons of our assumptions, when we work together to see in one another not set in stone wrong, but potential? The philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that human freedom offers the, quote, sheer capacity to begin anew, and is a deeply social condition, requiring the company of others. By protecting Ellis's right to oppose her, Atwater, against all odds, offered them both the gift of a second chance. "Nothing's changed," he tried to say, and she answered, "But it could." And the coda to that is that they became fast friends. Ellis and Atwater remained friends to their dying day, his dying day. She gave the eulogy at his funeral. He quit the KKK. He became a Duke University maintenance worker and then led their largely black union of maintenance workers. She remained a housing activist. And when I went to Durham, long after this, she was still a legend. In fact, one community activist told me, her move and his courage as well gave strength to all of us. It gives strength to all of us, they said. So in conclusion, nothing's changed, but it could. That's where the wisdom of uncertainty begins. Today, volatility is rising. We live with precarious work hours, precarious climate, geopolitics, how will we respond? A century ago, humans assumed the heavens were fixed and orderly. And now, of course, we know space and time are expanding and the laws of nature are increasingly seen to be provisional. It was not that many decades ago that the human mind was seen as set in stone by adulthood. And now, of course, we know that neurogenesis occurs throughout life. The quest for certainty, in Dewey's words, is fraying. And the cost of retreating into our airtight convictions, our knee-jerk solutions, is rising. Many psychologists see phones as certainty-seeking devices. Uncertainty is no panacea for the ills of our day, big and small, but recognizing that we might not know at any given moment, we can begin to free ourselves from the destruction of a closed mind. And I'm hopeful. I see that we are on the cusp of a seismic shift in the human approach to not knowing. In medicine, young doctors in Maine have been taught to say, "I don't know," which takes tremendous courage in their profession. They're taught that it's okay not to know. And in Norway, an NIH scientist right now is teaching doctors how to leverage their uncertainty as well as admit to it, to treat overdiagnosis and other ills of the profession. In AI, as Jenny mentioned, there is an incredible movement by some of the top leaders in the field to imbue robots and models with the ability to be unsure in their aims. Because, as I referenced, the rationalist dominant definition of intelligence is the ability to achieve a goal at all costs. That's what intelligence is. That's the foundation of AI. And therein lies the magic. It learns it as it goes without human oversight, and yet there is the risk as generalized AI becomes more powerful and, of course, unstoppable. So the top leaders in the field are teaching robots and models to be unsure in their aims, therefore not just stoppable, but teachable, honest. One roboticist calls this the humble robot. And I just was able to test drive a robotic arm that was drawing a line in a table in a Virginia Tech laboratory. It was just a sort of a manufacturing practice exercise. But that robot could non-verbally give me different approaches. How close do you want the arm to be to the table? How do you want me to do this? And then I could, type what scenario I wanted. I was part of the mix. Another euphemism for this trend is human-compatible AI. It's incredibly important and incredibly exciting. And one of the most interesting codas to that story is that numerous AI leaders told me that in working with uncertain AI, they felt that they were becoming more able to understand and emulate being unsure, which says a lot in the tech field. And I think that maybe someday we might work alongside technology that holds up a mirror to our better selves. So, and finally, to circle back to the little bird story, research psychologists, again, some of the tops in the field, are working on interventions, programs, and on strategies used in one-on-one sessions that help people become more tolerant, and I'll unpack that word, of uncertainty in order to contend with anxiety, worry, depression, or just stress. So tolerance of uncertainty is a personality disposition. We all have our comfort zone. We're all kind of somewhere on the spectrum. And it's just like introversion and extroversion, et cetera. And this disposition is situational. So when you're tired, when you're under pressure, when you're fatigued or other circumstances like that, you actually tip more toward intolerance of uncertainty. And I think that's something we all can be aware of at the difficult meeting, etc. But we all have this internal comfort zone as well that we bring to the table that is mutable. We can actually change and expand our comfort with uncertainty, as unsettling as it always will be. One of the simplest way to understand intolerance of uncertainty is that people who are intolerant are threatened by uncertainty. They despise you if you throw them a surprise party. They tend to be more rigid thinkers. They want to argue to win, not argue to learn. I mean, we're talking about the other extreme. But people who are more tolerant of uncertainty see it as a challenge. It's highly related to the curious disposition. And the facet of being tolerant of uncertainty, in other words, accepting of the unsettling nature of exploring the unknown, is the aspect of curiosity that's most related to well-being. So this is why certain leading psychologists think that intolerance of uncertainty is not only a new and important gateway into treating mental challenges, it might be the root, one fear to rule them all, as Nicholas Carlton says in Canada. And so some of these interventions just involve kind of a riff-off exposure therapy. So people are practicing in simple, small, practical ways how to become a little more not knowing. In other words, someone might be challenged, this is actual case, to delegate more at work because that person spends 20 hours a week on the job rather than delve into the unknown of allowing a junior colleague to do the project themselves. It's akin to not letting your family pack their own suitcase before a trip, things like that. Ohio State researchers are going to be helping stressed high schoolers who are not clinically diagnosed with anything, they're just having a stressful time next spring, learn to expand their tolerance of uncertainty through exercises such as answering their phone without caller ID. As simple as that. And that's something that a young relative of mine said would be terrifying for her generation, in all seriousness. So we can see that this makes sense. Simple practical steps to allow us to contend with uncertainty, to delight in uncertainty, to leverage and inhabit uncertainty, because when we can do so, we can contend with life, which is, after all, always going to be dynamic, unpredictable, volatile. The world is not bird-free. I mean uncertainty-free. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. So I had a question about uncertainty and financial incentive and just structure. To pick up on one example that you mentioned, polarization sort of is related to uncertainty. Polarization, one of the topics where polarization has come up is around social media and how social media is seen as polarizing people.
Right.
In the world of media research, it's come out that the platforms don't necessarily have the goal of polarizing users. They just want to be able to predict user behavior. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that people with more extreme views are easier to predict. And so therefore, you get pushed towards polarization. But the idea is just to predict user behavior to sell ads, essentially, right? And I guess I'm just wondering, so much of sort of the marketplace is based on certainty, right? And being able to say this is that. And there's less of a focus on the quality of the certain information. Where are the openings to kind of, if there's a movement for more uncertainty, how that interfaces with this?
Yes, so you're commenting that the online behavior is certainty-based and that the system, is the economic and other kinds of systems are sort of built on that scale, drive us to extremes, and you're right. What can I?
Well, I guess I was just wondering, like, uncertainty can be a financial liability, bottom line. And so, like, if one is advocating for more sort of an embrace of uncertainty, I'm just, whether in your research for the book you've come up just interesting examples of people navigating that terrain, or just maybe
Right.
not.
Yes. No. Well, yes. The book is filled with sort of heroes of uncertainty and people who, and studies like the CEOs who are, actually showing superior performance as a result of being ambivalent, or gaining greater group collaboration as a result. And I think maybe if I'm not misinterpreting what you're saying, there is a huge there are multiple, almost perfect storm of pressures on us today, to be sure. We inhabit an internet, which is basically a sort of a system of templates of another's thinking, and even the aesthetic of what we are inhabiting is box-like and clear and neat and pat and instant. I mean, there are studies that show that people who do a very short amount of searching online actually come away with a kind of hubris. In other words, they think they know more than they do, even if they didn't find what they were looking for, because somehow their identity melds with this limitless knowledge that's out there, which of course is an unequivocally positive situation, but we lose the understanding of where the limits of our knowledge lies. So therefore, we lose uncertainty. And that's extremely dangerous in any kind of learning situation. So I think, yes, there's so many multiple factors. There is the efficiency and the rationalist notion of outcome is being important. There is historic. There's the situational pressures that we face today from being tired and sleep deprived and feeling like we need to make an answer. All this, there is the technology relationship to to this pressure to be certain, and I think that it's very hard to push back on that. I can only say that little by little, and if we gain a sense of what's at stake, and if we can literally just change our view of the weakness and negativity about uncertainty that's synonymous with uncertainty, then we can begin to learn how to harness it and sort of counter this imbalance toward certainty. So I think that, I think it's really, I've been asked at talks, how can I as a leader show uncertainty when it's synonymous with weakness? And a very good question. But I think that we don't have to ride in, with uncertainty as the label of what we're doing. For instance, uncertainty is a way to keep a problem open. So that's maybe a softer, gentler, way to understand how to imbue a conversation or a problem-solving exercise with uncertainty. Hedge words have gotten a lot of media attention lately. It's actually a myth that they are a female kind of language. They're used by men and women, and they are, yes, seen as weakness, and yet they're the very Harvard studies show that just the very use of the word maybe or sometimes rather than wrong and therefore is related to the person who's using these words being seen as a better teammate, but also someone who's more a better performer as well. So we can use uncertainty to break the cycle of our assumptions about certainty, which isn't the case in a lot of ways what people are doing with these interventions, because they often predict, when I go on a first date, I can't do it because it'll be a disaster. Well, try it, and then you might see that there are multiple possibilities for that outcome, and you learn a little bit more about tuning into life, and you're using your broken expectations about uncertainty to actually practice that very skill. And as one scientist said, one of the world's greatest experts on learning told me, no surprise, no learning. So I think in small ways, I'm probably not completely answering your question because this is a new thing. I mean, changing our mind about uncertainty is new. We have to be pioneers. We have to take it home and we have to teach our kids. We have to just start. Are you ready? Yes.
I arrived a few minutes late, so I'm uncertain whether you covered this category. But have you talked generationally at all about this issue in terms of the research and whether it shows different things in different age groups?
In terms of uncertainty tolerance, well,
yeah,
I do.
Whether it shows up in different ways in different generations.
Yes, well, I mean, there's a little bit. I mean, there is some to some extent in my book. There isn't a lot about generational attitudes being different, except digital natives are perhaps more steeped in the certainty-seeking behavior that comes from checking one's devices. And so one study showed evidence, correlation, by no means the end answer, but that as the use of the internet and the adoption of cell phones rose, smartphones, intolerance of uncertainty rose among young people. And this is a really important study. And I asked many, for a forthcoming article, many of these very, very, very top experts in anxiety specialists or uncertainty experts, et cetera, whether they think so. And by large degree, they thought so, that intolerance and uncertainty is rising. So I don't know generationally whether that's true. I would say that maybe intolerance of uncertainty is rising, but from different pressures in different generations. Maybe technology is moving the needle a little bit for younger people. Maybe changes in the brain for older people, or just our polarization levels are experienced differently. I don't know. So it's a good question. I think it bears watching. A lot of this research is very new. I mean, it's a lot of gold standard research, but it's only in the last 10 years, 20 years that we've been studying these issues. So it's exciting days. It's really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering how this research and the writing of this book has shaped your own thinking.
Enormously. Yeah, enormously. There's so many ways. Well, first of all, I came across some research when I was doing Distracted about, I did a chapter about screen versus print. And I came across research of a sort of rock star in the library world, Carol Koltow, who has written about stages of research. And one of them was focus, so I was very interested in that. And another was frustration. And it was really illuminating to me that my, frustration in the depths and the trenches of writing these books is not because I'm, stupid or slow or whatever. I mean, it could be all that too, but, that somehow this was the part of the natural process. And I think that really, helped me enormously. And then uncertainty. I mean, again, do we like it? I was almost reluctant to start in on this when the book needed and wanted to pivot into uncertainty. It was a mess. I mean, it was all about probabilistic, mathematical, and then there was all this woo, oh yeah, let's all embrace uncertainty, but there's no science behind it. And then I found, that the lid was kind of blowing off the cave, so to speak. But it's changed me just enormously. I have to say that I now, I'll give you a couple examples. So that was all to say that I'm more, see it as a challenge, not a threat, when I'm uncertain in the research. But as well, now during COVID, I moved mostly to the country, missing the Society Library every minute, but became this open water 4-season swimmer. Yeah, I got a wetsuit, yes. I don't do it, in the bathing suit, but that is just uncertainty. You can look at the app, you can ask the locals what the conditions are, you can go and look, and even when you're there, in the middle of winter or in the hurricane season or what, and you're doing this 30-minute swim in the ocean, it's totally uncertainty. And I was wondering, why is this so joyful? Why is this so exhilarating? Why is this kind of the best thing ever? And I really realized that it was a daily dose of uncertainty, that I really was strengthening my capacity. You just have to take my word for it. There's no scientific proof, but I think it's spilled over into the rest of my life, and even without the swimming. So in doing this book, I also feel as though instead of sort of if a daughter's upset or a friend is upset, the common impulse is to offer a solution or change the subject to look on the silver lining. I mean, that can be true when somebody dies. People just want to wipe that one away. And I feel this has given me the capacity to inhabit their uncertainty, as unsettling it is, and to be with them in a way that doesn't have an answer. And that's been golden. And it's also made me more creative when it came to this very tense moment of dismantling this house of my husband's family, and everything was really tense. I won't go into that, but I just instead of racing to you wrong, this person right, I kind of tried to get certain parties to step back, and then I realized that there could be a trade of these material objects rather than a win-lose situation. So again and again, I feel like uncertainty has been totally changed my lens, my lens on the world. So thank you for asking. We have time for
Maybe one more question?
I'm sorry, long answers.
Hi. I'm wondering whether you found a substantive difference, people in the creative arts, the creative fields versus people who have a scientific, empirical imperative. I mean, there's always a problem to be solved, whether it's music or art or you're coming to a solution, but the process is so different, and I'm wondering how you found the difference in uncertainty / curiosity.
Yes. Well, I think that there's creativity in science enormously. So I would say I did find these wonderful veins of, as you might imagine, relationship between creativity and uncertainty, and staying in uncertainty. One other facet, I've talked about uncertainty as a kind of spur. I've talked about it as a space in which we can explore. There's also a suspense to uncertainty. That can be sleeping on a problem. It can be having a daydream. I call it putting time on your side. And the benefits you reap from these very simple, we kind of know this is true, but I was blown away by the mental activity. And again throughout the book, I found that when we are at rest, when we're doing nothing, the brain is often more active than when we are carrying out that task. This occurs when you are between movements of a symphony. Literally the activation of the brain it is higher than when you're listening to the music. It occurs when you're daydreaming, and that's a kind of what happens is that your networks of the brain related to perception fall quiet, and the network and other networks, especially the default mode that's related to meaning making and self-awareness and assessing others, revs up. And so you are falling within yourself. And one thing that's really interesting about that is that daydreaming is, I call it the sketchbook of the mind. It's a portable space for errors and wrong turns and, scratching things out. It's a what-if scenario that is actually known now to be highly future-oriented. So you're sort of doing scenarios. And even if negative, you might have a daydream about your talk with your boss, that you didn't think was going to go well, even that negative future-oriented daydreaming is, they call it palliative. That is, it lowers your stress because you're somehow, trying out the world. And that is highly related to the cognitive flexibility that seeds divergent or creative thinking. So the ability to, move from one type of thinking to the other, which is really important to creativity, is something that you see in spades and neurally and in behavior in the daydream. So I visited a neuroscientist in LA who studies young teenagers in very challenged circumstances and people, she does longitudinal studies. So, and she asked them about, among other things, about daydreams. And she's now beginning to find that the young teenagers who daydream in complex ways are more socially adept, do better at school. I mean, they're really succeeding against a lot of odds. And, because they have that cognitive flexibility to move from viewpoint to viewpoint, they really get ahead. So I think creativity is very, very important to uncertainty. And I don't know of any studies that would show whether artists are more tolerant of uncertainty, but I bet that would be the case. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Maggie
much.
Jackson.
Thank you.